The Second World War featured a series of conflicts among different countries of the world. These conflicts saw the creation of two major alliances, the Allied forces and the Allied powers, who fought against each other for their interests during the war. In this video on Warzone, we've detailed just who the Allied forces were and just how they were able to emerge eventual victors during World War II. But before we jump right in, do give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Make sure to turn on your notifications and leave us a comment as well, as we'd love to read your opinions on the composition and war tactics of the Allied forces. The Allied forces were a group of countries that opposed and fought a group of three countries who made up the Axis powers during the Second World War. These Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. When the war broke out, Germany's expansionist ideology and Jewish anti-Semitism were opposed by Britain, France, and their colonies as well. But after Germany successfully invaded and defeated France, Britain remained the only opposition Germany faced at the time, until the Soviets and the United States decided to enter the war. The Second World War saw major totalitarian regimes fight against united democratic governments. It was as though the two opposing forces were reflecting the struggle between freedom and tyranny. It is important to note that during the war, a number of countries switched allegiances for varied reasons. An instance would be to take countries like Hungary and Romania for example, which were among nations that switched from supporting the Axis powers to supporting the Allied forces towards the end of the war. This was because they had been initially coerced into joining Axis forces. The government of Free India joined the Axis powers by fighting alongside Japan to express its opposition to Britain's colonial rule, rather than seeing Japan as a natural ally. The Allied forces after the war became the founders and creators of what we now know as the United Nations today. They wanted to set up an intergovernmental organization that would resolve conflicts peacefully and establish a world of peace, freedom, and justice for all. They signed the Declaration by the United Nations on the 1st of January 1941, stating that a complete victory was necessary against their enemies if liberty, independence, and religious freedom were to exist, and they were obliged to engage in a common struggle against tyrants and brutal force seeking to dominate the world. All founding members of the UN were essentially anti-Axis powers during the start of the Second World War. Before the Second World War began, the Republic of China had been fighting Japan since 1937. In the early 1930s, Germany and China became close partners in areas of military and industrial exchange. Germany provided China with its largest proportion of Chinese arms imports and technical expertise. China lost many territories to Japan during this period. Although Germany provided support for China and denounced Japanese war crimes in China, it later recognized that Japan was more capable of fighting the Soviet Union and soon broke off its cooperation with China in May 1938. The Soviets intervened and helped the Chinese since they wanted to keep China in the fight against Japan and supplied China with needed military aid and equipment until 1941. China had been fighting the longest among all Allied countries even before it officially became a member, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. Chiang, the Chinese ruler at the time, was convinced that the Allied forces were going to emerge victorious, especially after the United States joined the war and declared war on Germany and other Axis nations. Although the US had entered the war, Allied aid and supplies remained low, and the Allies would suffer a series of military defeats against Japan earlier on in the campaign. On September 1st, 1939, the German invasion of Poland kick-started the Second World War, and Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand all declared war on Germany immediately after the invasion of Poland commenced. Nepal, Newfoundland, Tonga, South Africa, and Canada also joined the US as it prepared to partner with the Allied forces. On September 17, 1939, the Soviets would orchestrate another invasion of Poland, and by 1940, they had succeeded in annexing the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania together with parts of Romania, before going on to invade Finland as well. The German-Soviet pact would later collapse in 1941, after an invasion of the Soviet Union by Germany. The following year, the Declaration by the United Nations officially united 26 nations as allies, who had pledged to accept the Atlantic Charter and agreed not to negotiate a separate peace with any of the Axis powers. These declarations formed the foundation for the United Nations. The informal Big Three alliances of the United Kingdom, the Soviets, and the United States emerged in the latter parts of the war. The decision of these big allies would strongly influence the course of the war. After the end of the Phony War, over 11 countries joined the Allied forces, and after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 10 more countries joined in the war effort against the Axis powers. The Franco-Polish alliance was signed in 1939 and triggered France's and Britain's support for Poland following the invasion by Germany. Several independent members of the Commonwealth of Nations, known as the Dominions, also declared war on Germany separately after the invasion of Poland. Territories in Iceland, Greenland, Denmark, and a Danish colony were occupied by the Allies for most of the war. British forces took over Iceland in 1940, and the territory was used to facilitate the movement of Lend-Lease equipment for the war effort. The United States forces, however, occupied Greenland and took over Iceland in July 1941. Portugal remained neutral at first when the war broke out, but the Anglo-Portuguese alliance was invoked, which led to the establishment of an Allied base in the Azores. Although it protested the occupation of Portuguese Timor by the Allied forces in 1942, it didn't put up any resistance. The colony was subsequently invaded by Japanese troops, so the Timorese and Portuguese civilians would later assist the Allied forces in resisting the Japanese and the other Axis power.